Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sad to say that this is the last of the World War I series, but it's a nice sadness, a nice reflective sadness, because it's been a wonderful journey to take with many of you, now for the third time, and especially with our students. You're in for a wonderful program today, not to be undone by a wonderful presentation you're going to hear by my colleague and friend, Steven Morrison. Steven is a musician who wears many hats, and he wears them skillfully. Just yesterday, he spent a whole day in Mount Vernon with 60 middle schoolers who gave up their Saturday as well as he did to make the magic of music and collaborate together. He's a skillful conductor. His class on the psychology of music here is one of the most popular ones. And perhaps most elevated at all is Steven's research on the brain, human cognition, how we learn, how we perceive, how we cultivate our biases, all very wonderful forward-looking things. And he's here now to give us a new lens on the growth of recorded music during the time of World War I. Please welcome Dr. Steven Morrison.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute honor to be here and to share in this marvelous series. Thank you very much, Robin, for asking me. It was as much of an honor as it was to get the invitation. I had to think a bit because I know the first lecture from a historian seems very obvious. A lecture from a philosopher also seems very obvious. Then a member of the music education faculty. So it was kind of left to me to figure out how that fits in to the topic of the Great War. Happily, I had almost a full year to think about that, and I've come up with something that I will submit for hopefully your approval. The topic that I'm going to dive into slowly is the idea that music is something that is far broader than what we hear. Music is something that is experienced multimodally. It's something that we come to understand through a variety of channels. And it seems somewhat at odds with that for me to spend the whole time standing behind this podium and talking about it. So I will occasionally drift out there to add just a little bit more movement to the proceedings. I am from Maryland. I grew up in Baltimore. And as such, I was maybe more in touch with the history of that part of the country. I was very keen on the American Civil War. My parents were children during World War II, so those memories were part of our household. My family members were in the armed services during the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War. But the First World War was kind of a big hole in my knowledge for a long time. We had a couple volumes in the basement called The History of the First World War in Pictures, or something like that. And to me, as a child, those pictures looked pretty old and uninteresting, so I never really dove into that. Recently, I've had the opportunity to learn a lot more about that time. Last summer, I found myself in Sarajevo, which is a wonderful city with wonderful people, a city that is just oozing with history. And of course, the more recent tragic history of Sarajevo is in the forefront. But certainly, all its many layers of history are right there on display. As we're walking around town, of course, one immediately comes to what's currently called the Latin Bridge, which has been called many things over the past century. Currently, it's the Latin Bridge. And of course, on the one side of the Latin Bridge is a little intersection where a century ago, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. And right at that corner, there's a little museum, a very earnest and sincere, fascinating little museum. And emblazoned on the side of that museum is a big legend that you can read from all over the place. This is the place where the 20th century began. As we heard 2 concerts ago, the 19th century is considered a long century that ended in 1914, when the 20th century actually began. In terms of music, thinking of what was happening at that time, the period of the Great War, one can see sort of a pivot point. Now, it's not my purpose today to talk about how music itself changed as a result of that war. There's a wonderful book by Glenn Watkins called Proof Through the Night, Music of the Great War, that I would recommend for that purpose. But I'm going to, today, talk about how we came to think about music and how that changed, coincident with the period of the Great War. So while there were shifts in compositional style, and there were new styles that began to emerge. I mean, in 1917, the very first jazz record was pressed. So things were changing in music. But maybe as a backdrop to all this, what we saw was an increasing emphasis on sonic information. Professor Stacy, in his talk, referred to a search for a perceptual art. I think it's a very accurate way of getting at the idea of music evolving into something that we consider the art of sound. And many factors were playing into this at that time, and we'll explore a couple of those. But let's fast forward a little bit. Let's fast forward a bit to a different era, the era of the 1960s and early 1970s, the era of the Vietnam War. At that time, the music of the war consisted of specific and very proprietary recordings. You know, we all think of particular songs that are tied to that time, and the artists who performed them, and in many cases, wrote them. We could think of ranging from Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind to Creedence Clearwater's Fortunate Son. We can identify tunes such as Edwin Starr's War or Barry McGuire's Eve of Destruction. These were particular performances that became iconic and have remained so. If we back up a little further to the time of World War II, there were iconic songs, but maybe less proprietary in nature. For example, I'll Be Seeing You, one of the beautiful ballads of the Second World War, was a big hit by Glenn Miller and Tex Beneke and the Modernaires, and also by Harry James and the Andrews Sisters, and also by Kay Kaiser, and by many others. So the songs of World War II were performances, but they were performances by many people. They were songs that were shared across the performance and even competed for customers and for listeners. For example, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree or The White Cliffs of Dover, all classic anthems of World War II. In contrast, the music of World War I was not so much music that were iconic recordings or even songs that were put forward by record labels to compete for your attention. They were songs that were to be sung, and they were songs that were to be played. For instance, Keep the Home Fires Burning, Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag, or this particular tune, Goodbye Broadway, Hello France. I pulled this one out because I was just looking through my office, and I thought, I think I have something in here that would be appropriate for this talk. And sure enough, I pulled this out, dating from 1917. This will pop up again in just a moment. Probably here in the United States, the classic World War I song is Over There. And certainly, there were recorded versions of it. Let's listen to one from 1917 right now, just a snippet. So those of you who are students of classical voice may be disappointed to know that for many, many years that was the largest selling recording by an operatic performer. That was Enrico Caruso singing Over There. And while for its time it was considered a hit recording, the number of people who had listening devices was very small, and music on the radio wasn't in existence yet. So the song was something that would be sung. For example, in this perhaps more familiar version of the song. That's the version I knew as a kid, and that dates from 1942. And judging from some of the nodding in the room, you recognized it as well. Somewhere embedded in all those voices was James Cagney from the movie Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? The story of George M. Cohan. It's striking to think of George M. Cohan as a person who was a song and dance man, a person who performed music, a person who made music and was viewed as an entertainment package. Whereas if we think of music of a later period, of the Vietnam War, perhaps the person that comes to mind is Robin Williams' character of Adrian Cronauer in Good Morning Vietnam. So in one case you have the performer, and in one case you have the person who is spinning the discs. Very different conceptions of the role music played. Interestingly, in an effort to, let's say, raise the motivation level, to focus the attention, to promote the good health and moral standing of American troops, in 1917, President Wilson approved the formation of the Commission on Training Camp Activities. In a fascinating study by Li-cheng, she reports that as part of the training camp activities was the placement at every training camp in the United States of a singing teacher. So the troops were engaged in singing, and one event that I'm sore that I missed was a version of Goodbye Broadway, Hello France, sung by no fewer than 38,000 troops at a camp in Illinois. An amazing thing. So music, the role that music played, and the way that people thought of music at the time of the Great War was as something that people did. And as the century progressed, music became something that people listened to. The power of making music and the way we think of making music perhaps was expressed most lovely by soldier Patrick McGill. Again, quoting from Cheng's article, he says, "The content of the songs matters little. The soldier's encouragement and soothing comes from the mere fact that he is singing. In moments of stress or monotony or grief or hope, his thoughts find best expression in music." And that well defines the goal of the singing teachers for World War I troops. So if we think back to music during the period of the Great War and before, it was something that was something that people did. And with that, if you were going to encounter music, you were going to have to either go see it or make it yourself. And what does this mean? It means that the opportunity to create music or to witness the creation of music allows you access to things that a recorded piece of music is not going to give you. For example, and I wanted to share a few specific findings of recent research with you. For example, when watching performances of a marimba player, this study was done about 10 years ago by Schutz and Lipscomb. Watching performances of a marimba player, the marimba player was asked to perform notes that were very short in duration and notes that were very long in duration. So as you can imagine what those things would look like, you would have the player come out and play something very short, which might be like that, or something very long, which might be like that. For those of you with a fair knowledge of percussion instruments, or perhaps of physics, knows that a marimba is not an instrument that allows you to regulate the length of notes. So when people were asked to identify the length of the notes that were played with the visual component of crispness and shortness were identified as short notes, and those played with a smooth and flowing action were identified as long notes. So this visual information seemed to affect the way that people were hearing what was happening. Similarly, in a study by Thompson and colleagues, they drew on video recordings of performances by popular singers, including Judy Garland. Now, when Judy Garland was performing with a very positive affect, upturned face, a smile, which was not all that common, those pieces were identified as pieces that we would call them in major mode. And when she was more dour, when she was a little more downcast or frowning, those pieces were identified as being in minor, even though they weren't. So the physical portrayal of the sound affected people's interpretation of the modality in which it was occurring. Similarly, guitar solos by B.B. King, when he would be demonstrating a great deal of effort and intensity, his melodic notes were identified as rising, whereas if he was a little more relaxed and laid back, they were identified as falling, when in fact, again, that was not the case. So it seems that visual information not only has an impact, but may even trump auditory information. So what happens when we lose that? Well, let's ask a different question. We'll come back to that one, but let's ask a different question. That being, well, what about, okay, these are little moments in time. What about more robust musical performances? What about intact, full-blown performances? Well, in a study by Dan Levitin and colleagues, you may know Dr. Levitin is the author of This Is Your Brain on Music. He did a study looking at clarinet players and asked them to perform Stravinsky's clarinet concerto. And he found that players that were playing with a great deal of movement were judged as playing much more expressively than players that were not, even though all of the auditory information, all of the sound recording was the same. So, and the Stravinsky piece is not one that lends itself to overly romanticized interpretations, yet still, movement seemed to add a layer of expressivity that people identified as being present when there was movement and absent when there wasn't. In a recent study by Tse that was reported in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and reported on NPR about a year ago, you may have heard, she asked people to evaluate piano performances. We're getting a little closer to home here. Asked them to evaluate piano performances, and these performances were taken from a global competition. And what she wanted to know is whether people, after listening to the performances or after watching the performances, would be able to identify the person who, in fact, was identified as the winner. So she asked people if they would like to hear or if they would like to see the performance, and whether they thought hearing the performance would be more helpful or if seeing the performance would be more helpful. And invariably, over 95% of the people who participated in this study said, I need to hear it. So she allowed them to do both. She allowed them to hear part of the performance and see part of the performance. When they heard it, of course, there was no visual information, and when they saw it, there was no auditory information. And by far, they were much more accurate at identifying the performers that were the champion pianists based on their visual information. We've done work in this area here at the University of Washington, looking at the unique case of conductors, because in the best case, conductors are people who are closely identified with music yet make no sounds. So if what they do is gesture, how does their gesture affect not the performers in front of them, but the audience behind them? And sure enough, similar to solo performers, we found that when conductors are doing things that are very expressive in nature and very musically appropriate in nature, the performance itself, which they have no hand in, is judged as more expressive. And when they're conducting very neutrally, the performers' performances are being judged as less expressive. So the visual component becomes quite important. Why is that so? Why might that be so? Well, when we look at the role of movement in music, it generally can be characterized as doing one of three things. The first one is that it generates the sound of music. And I think this is the one we think of when we think of music and movement. This is the stuff that if you make this move, a sound is going to happen. If you go like this to a drum, it will sound. If you press a piano key, it will sound. But that's but one type of movement. Movement could also facilitate the organization of movement. So later today, when we see groups of musicians together, we will see them engage in movements that help keep things organized. When does someone come in? How is this change in tempo going to happen? How much are we going to slow down at the end of the piece? And the third thing is that movement communicates. It can communicate structure. In studies by Luck and Williamson and others, they found that observing pianists, their movements were the most frequent and largest, most obvious, at key structural moments in the music. It might be at a high point of a phrase, it might be at a change of section, but you could watch them and get a sense of the structure of the piece, or at least what they perceive to be the structure of the piece. So it could communicate that. It could communicate meaning. It could communicate emotional content. So movement has a number of roles that it plays. I bring this up because as the century moved along and we got further and further away from experienced music visually, one might suggest that our experience of music, or at least our belief in our experience of music, somewhat changed in nature. This was underscored at about the same time with the rise of psychology, and particularly the rise of psychometric testing. In the mid to late 19th century, there was a fascination with all sorts of mental processes and how they could be evaluated and compartmentalized. This led, of course, to Binet and Simon developing the first, what we might call intelligence test in 1905, which was, the spirit of which was adapted during the Great War in the military for testing and evaluation and placement of the soldiers. Those were known as the Army Alpha and Beta tests, and they came online around the midpoint of the war. Music was part of that scene as well. In 1916, Carl Seashore developed his measures of musical talents. And it's interesting to note that the way that he measured musical talent were according to pitch. So if you heard two pitches, could you tell if they were the same or different? According to intensity, if you heard two pitches, could you tell which was louder or softer? According to time, if you heard three pitches, could you decide whether the space between the first two was similar or different from the space between the second two? Consonants, could you decide whether two pitches sounding together were pleasing or not pleasing in their nature? And tonal memory. If you heard a little melodic fragment and then you heard a second melodic fragment that was a little different, could you identify where the difference was? So it's interesting to consider that the idea of musical talent was equated with how well we can perceive music through our ears. Certainly, being able to perceive music with our ears is important. For a person to achieve in music, at some point, the experience of hearing that music becomes critical. However, more recent research has determined that beyond issues of perception, music knowledge is best characterized by the integration of information. So, for example, if you hear this tune, and I'll ask Gary to play an example for you. Now, you'll recognize that as one of two tunes. Okay? Based on our theme today, we will call that America. Okay? But listen to this tune. Which we will also call America. Now, the interesting thing about those two examples of America is that there is absolutely nothing that is similar about them. They're two different instruments, played at two different tempos, played in two different keys, in two different modalities, in two different meters. There are no pitches in the first one that appear in the second one, and vice versa. Yet, we can recognize both of them as being the same thing. So again, the importance of integration becomes critical and not simply a matter of what we're perceiving in our ears. So to bring this all together, to conclude, the musical world that emerged in the wake of the Great War was, of course, quite different than that existed at its beginning. Not only because of the emergence of new styles, new ideas, new visions of humanity, or the reflection of the cataclysm recently concluded, but far from past. The musical world of the new 20th century, which, as we recall, began in 1914, was one that was mediated by technology and focused on sound. Music was something that was increasingly heard rather than witnessed, and eventually witnessed rather than generated by oneself. Music became a sonic art. In turn, we came to believe that music was experienced with the ears. We came to believe that the sensitivity of those same ears provided a key to our talents, or our aptitudes, or our abilities. Since that time, research has shown us that music is far from being a simply sonic art. It is a human activity that is robust and multimodal in nature. It is experienced, conceptualized, created, interpreted, and evaluated using seemingly all the sensory and cognitive capabilities we can bring to bear. Music is as much what we see as what we hear. A bit of information that will likely be the source of some disappointment for those who might be joining us via podcast. Happily, music is not only what we see, nor is it only what we hear. It's also what we imagine, what we remember, and how we move, along with those who may be moving on the stage to create the performance. So, as we enjoy the fantastic performances on this afternoon's program, let's take a moment here and there to notice how many different aspects of this event are intersecting to give rise to our experience. It will seem like music to our ears, but it will be much more than that. Thank you very much.
Vaughan Williams, in 1914, August, was vacationing in Margate on the coast with his wife. It was early August. The war was warming up, but it hadn't quite started. He was walking along the cliffs, jotting notes on paper for the very piece you're going to hear. Out in the channel, the English fleet was beginning its exercises. Actually, some of these ships were actually going to go to the Antarctic with Shackleton, if you can imagine. These were the very ships that were going to go with the Endurance to their voyage in Antarctica. And Vaughan Williams was thinking about his piece and taking notes, and a young English boy saw him, thought he was jotting down code for the enemy, and made a citizen's arrest. Vaughan Williams went to jail. He got out soon after that. The Lark Ascending, in 2011, they took a poll in Britain. It was your desert island disc. This piece usurped Rachmaninoff, Elgar. It was the #1 favorite in Britain, continues to be today. In 2011, New Yorkers were asked, what piece would you think most appropriate to be evocative of 911? This piece came in second. Don't ask me what was first, I don't know, so I'm begging you don't ask me. Now, The Lark Ascending, the poetry I copied out for you, it's interesting. This poem by George Meredith is 122 lines long. The reason you just see this little excerpt is because these are the very lines that Vaughan Williams inscribed on the flyleaf of the manuscript. They aren't even sequential. They're the beginning of the poem, part of the middle, and part of the end. So obviously this was some encapsulation of the meaning of the poem. We would be wrong to dismiss this piece as a pretty postcard. It is that. It's a wonderful evocation of rural England, the countryside, of course the lark. But it's much more. There's much more here. There's loss, there's angst. I think there's an agony of presentiment as Vaughan Williams and as many creative people realized that the world was basically going to hell in a handbasket. but a beautiful piece of music. Please help me welcome Alion and Li-cheng to play the Vaughan Williams. Now you are about to take a very adventurous excursion. The piano etudes of Debussy were pioneer work. We're now in the summer of 1915, a year later after Vaughan Williams. Of course, the war is raging. Debussy is very, very ill. He finds himself at Pourville on the coast. He loves the sea. And somehow his creative demons come back and give him some energy. In a mere 6 weeks, he's able to sketch the outlines for the 12 piano etudes, 6 of which you're going to hear today. He wrote to his publisher, "These are yet unheard of sounds." And amazingly, what he does in these pieces, and it's in a way an ironic pity that they're called etudes. They are not academic exercises at all. Each one is a sonic adventure on the piano into a new landscape, and you're going to hear some of these. Each piece demands a certain different number of configurations for the hands, and I suppose in those ways we could call them an etude. So my colleague Craig Shepard played these in their entirety a couple of seasons ago, and that music is still in my ears, as this will be in yours. The first etude is dedicated to Mr. Czerny. Now, those of you who play piano, I suspect you have some memories of Mr. Czerny. My own childhood memories of fitting my fingers into those nasty 5-finger patterns over and over, the eagle ears of my mother in the next room. You know, ladies and gentlemen, those were the days that I thought, I think I really would be rather be outside playing kick the can. That was a professional crisis at age 10. So we all cut our teeth on some Czerny, but Debussy has enormous fun in this etude because he keeps interrupting the exercises with mischievous little escapades. They can be a little naughty, they can be audacious, and every once in a while he tries to ensnare the pianist in these difficult patterns, and then he bursts out and uses the entire keyboard, up, pop, bottom, as if to say, I will not be confined to this. And Debussy dedicates it and says, play this with humor, and there's obvious humor in these pieces, obviously modeled after Chopin. Debussy himself made an edition of the Chopin etudes, and while there is humor and charm in the Chopin, there's ever so much more of that ingredient in these pieces. So after the 5 fingers, we go to 8 fingers. Now, why 8 fingers? Well, this etude, which moves like greased lightning, is to be played without your thumbs. And I can vouch that this is what a frustrating exercise. I learned this piece myself. It drove me crazy, but I kept coming back to it. It's fascinating. Very light, a brief piece, but again, the entire keyboard is used in these marvelous kinds of textures. Now, after the 8 fingers, we go to chromatic tones, half tones, these tones. Think of the flight of a bumblebee on steroids, because that's what this piece is. Chromaticism gone to turbo mode all over the keyboard. Fantastic, again, textures, displays of light, sudden color. The pianist, I will say, has to be a conjurer with these pieces because it's to do so many things so quickly. Now, after the chromatic degrees, we go to, I think, the most mysterious. That is the opposing sonorities, contrasting sounds. Now, Alex Ross writes about these pieces that there is an element of, quote, icy fury in them. And this was, again, Debussy's raging against the war. It's a time where he's extremely upset about it. I don't find all the etudes have this, but there is a quality in this piece, and then there's a little motive that I'm going to play for you, which I'm convinced is a bugle cry from the battlefield. Now, ironically, first time you hear it, what does Debussy mark in the score? Clear and with joy. But it's a bugle call. So listen to it. It's very brief. That's a bugle call, I'm convinced. So it's in the etude, and he says, with joy. A little while later, it comes back, and he says, far away, the same bugle call. Then it comes back, and he says, farther away still. And then, let me show you what he does with the bugle call. He fragments it, he collapses it, and what you heard first is now disintegrating, and you only have then a chord which I think is pure ice. That chord, ladies and gentlemen, is collapsed upon itself. It contains the notes of the bugle. So Debussy is painting something evocative here, and I think it recalls battle, where the call is at first joyous. We know there's much behind the joy, much pain. And I'm convinced of this also because at this point in time he writes a 2-piano piece on blanc et noir, white and black, and it's full of battle sounds. It's full of little trumpets and bugles and little fragments of French patriotic songs. So it was very much in his head. So after this etude, which again exploits contrast in textures, don't just think loud and soft. This is thick and thin, light and dark, rough, every kind of articulation you can imagine. Then we move to the arpège composé, the arpeggios. This was the most popular etude early on, and for an obvious reason. It is the most beautiful in the traditional sense of beauty. It has the most lovely melodies. It's also got a Spanish serenade in the middle of it. It's just a beautiful, beautiful piece. And interestingly, he marks it lusingando in the beginning, which means with allure. Allure. Well, how do we make allure? So again, a wonderful mark. Debussy is full of those kinds of marks. Now, the final etude that Laura will play, there's also humor with this one. This is for the chords, but it's ever so much more. Think a high wire act with no net. Debussy wrote to his publisher, this one is a Swedish gymnast, and the gymnastics are all over the place. So again, an exploitation of an idea, but there's a middle part which is absolutely beautiful. It sounds like, it belongs in something else. So these 6 etudes, again, are half the cycle. They are an adventure. There was nothing like this written at this time. I think it opened up sonic vistas for other composers. And the piano is really not a piano here. Think of this as Debussy's paint box, because that's really what it is. So Laura will now play the music of her countryman, Claude Debussy. Please join me in welcoming her. We're now going to hear 3 dances from the very, very popular ballet, El Amor Brujo. This translates as Love the Magician or Bewitched Love. It's the story of a gypsy woman who's lost her husband. He's dead. His ghost continues to haunt her. And the village tries to help her exorcise this ghost. And it turns out that she finally discovers this lost husband, her widower, was unfaithful to her for many years. And this heightens her determination to exorcise his ghost. So in the second dance, the magic circle is a very kind of medieval, hypnotic, timeless sequence that you can hear the 2 instruments. This is the village trying to invoke whatever powers would exorcise the ghost from Carmela. The first dance is the dance of the will-o'-the-wisp. And of course, the last one needs no explanation. This is the famous ritual fire dance. Falla was a great patriot. At the time the war broke out, he was in Paris. And quite unhappily, he had to beat it home to Madrid. Anyone who was in Paris in 1914 would really rather have stayed there. Everything artistic was going on there. But he did go back and had another period of very great creativity. He was a patriot, he violently anti-German, published a lot of things against Strauss and Schoenberg. This piece, these 3 dances, as you'll hear, are perfect encapsulation of this kind of simmering Spanish culture. It's all the things that we associate with this heat and torpor and underlying passion. So here are Stella and Dennis to play 3 dances from Love the Magician. Delicate instrument, so you can see the precision, the tiny micro movements needed to make all that beautiful music, and all those hundreds of hours spent with an instrument like that to get what we hear today. It's really quite remarkable. America was a bit late to go into the Great War, as we know. There were numerous reasons. President Wilson wasn't exactly eager, and many others were not as well. There's no blame cast here, it's just point of fact. But when they did get into the war, mass patriotism took place in the country. As a matter of fact, there was a bit of musical paranoia. Beethoven and Wagner were immediately eliminated from all symphonic programs. The Pittsburgh Symphony canceled all its Beethoven for the season. The conductor of the Boston Symphony, Carl Muck, was thrown into prison because there was a spurious report that he refused to conduct the Star-Spangled Banner, so they threw him in jail. And the rumors abounded that out his little sea island Maine cabin on the sea, he was messaging German U-boats and giving them information. So poor Muck was finished with that. So you can't blame America for the paranoia either. It's one of those normal things that happens. Now, Charles Ives, certainly an American original, an unusual life. He was a great musician. He was also a very, very wily insurance salesman and loved the business and did very well by it. His father was a bandmaster, a very adventurous guy, and the stories go that Charles and his younger brother would sit beside the piano, and Dad would play How Great Thou Art in C major and force the boys to sing along in E flat major. It couldn't have been a pretty sound, but it was immensely intriguing to his father, who had this adventurous idea. And of course, we know that Ives many times said he loved the sound of two high school bands playing different tunes in the same 4th of July celebration. So there's all that brewing in this very, very adventurous, canny mind. He was a patriot, like every American, but the 3 songs you're going to hear, although patriotic, are laced with a certain bit of arsenic and vinegar. And I think this is Ives' innate cynicism, his bitterness over all these lives being lost. And you'll hear some quotations also. You'll certainly recognize this. Columbia, the gem of the ocean, Over There are in these songs. They pop out at different times. So these are definitely war songs. They are definitely evocations of American spirit, but there's an undercurrent, and it's slightly disturbing. But it's, again, Ives wanting to communicate not just patriotism, but great sorrow, great feeling of the resignation of how useless this was. And I dare say that if we could magically roll back history and undo one event of the 20th century, I believe there's no argument. It would be to have not had that war, because it was the outcome of World War I, the bitterness of Germany, that engendered the roots for World War II. We've simply made a pretty big hash of it. So you're going to hear the American feistiness here and also an undercurrent of sadness, but really quite interesting songs. Charles Ives is not pretty in the conventional sense, but he's witty, he's tangy, and he does capture a lot of American dimension in these tunes. Well, welcome Dakota and Jane.
Do or die, and our Yankee
We've almost come to the end of our journey together. 3 concerts, 3 wonderful lectures, wonderful repertoire, a vast spectrum of emotions and vocabularies that you've heard. It's been a rich journey for me, and I hope as well for you. We've also looked at many aspects of the war, of the Great War. We've talked about the ironies, the multiple ironies. We've talked about the devastation, the loss. If I think of one transcendent quality about the outcome of the war, one outcome, one result which transcends all others, it is disillusion. As D.H. Lawrence said, the great words have no use for us anymore. They've outmoded themselves. Nobody put a better finger on this than Ernest Hemingway, and he did it in 1929 in the wonderful novel A Farewell to Arms, which takes place in Italy in the First World War. When I was in college at this very university, I read this book, and I didn't understand this following passage. Abstract words like honor, courage, glory are obscene when placed beside the names of towns, villages, rivers, and the numbers of regiments. That's exactly what D.H. Lawrence was saying. Let's not talk about these glorified words. The disillusion was permeated the literature and the art so much. So it was the concrete. Remember Rupert Brooke? We talked about Rupert Brooke, who was killed in the war. Those wonderful poems, like swimmers leaping clean in cleanness into the fray. The fray was not clean. It was the most tremendous disillusion. And all war is ironic because it's all worse than we ever expected, but this war was grandly ironic. And it left us with a permanently world dark view. I think we can all agree about that. And prepared the stage for Hitler to come in and say, Germany has been so badly treated. It's time to get moving again, and that's exactly what happened. Now, Prokofiev was in London when the war broke out. His mother had basically got him a present for graduating from the conservatory in St. Petersburg, and that was a trip to London. And he was disturbed, but Prokofiev was quite spared. Many men of his intellectual and educational class never really understood the atrocities. He traveled through much of the war. He was in Italy. He just wasn't really aware of it that much. He was also the only son of a widow, and for that reason, he was spared any idea of conscription. But from what we guess, he wouldn't have been very keen on enlisting anyway. Monica's final piece here really has nothing directly to do with the war. This music, actually, Prokofiev composed it as a student and then reworked it later in 1917. It's his briefest sonata, but in many ways, I think it's the most fabulous because of all it brings in this compressed amount of time. Enormous energy. The second theme is something very typical of Prokofiev. I think it's a very fairy tale-like quality. His melodies often leap up. Think of the concerto. They have this kind of wonderful interval that leaps up where you least expect it. It gives the music a very buoyant flavor. And again, very fairy tale-like for me. So you'll hear the abundant energy of the outside sections, and then this magical little intermezzo fairy tale, I'll call it. There's turbulence, there's every kind of texture in this. Again, a brief piece, but very muscular, not as theatrical as some of his later sonatas, but I think a great piece. So please join me in welcoming Monica for Sonata number 3.